Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today we'll be talking to Dr. Chase Straw about linking turfgrass variability and athlete data. Why is it important to link athlete and turfgrass data? What is the relationship between lab and field results in these areas? How can these studies improve player perceptions and reduce injuries? Answers to all these and more coming right up. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, today we've got Chase Straw with us. Chase grew up in Frankfort, Kentucky. He received his undergraduate degree in 2010 from the University of Kentucky in plant and soil science with a turfgrass science emphasis. As an undergrad, he interned twice with the Boston Red Sox and once with the Cincinnati Bengals as a member of their grounds crew. He earned his master's and PhD in 2014 and 2017, respectively, from the University of Georgia in crop and soil science, also with a turfgrass science emphasis, before spending 2018 and 2019 as a postdoc within the turfgrass science program at the University of Minnesota. He became an assistant professor of turfgrass management and physiology in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Texas A&M University in February of 2020. Hi, Chase. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Abby. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we are so glad to have you on the show today. We are getting close to what would be the fall football season, American football in the U.S. anyway. Probably a little different this year, but we also wanted to highlight a lot of the cool research that's happening in those areas. And you just did a review paper that's kind of addressing this issue. Can you just on a high level tell me what your review paper was about?
Sure. The review focused primarily on natural turfgrass sports fields. So there was no involvement with the artificial turf. And what it looked at was it really wanted to highlight how natural turfgrass sports fields vary through space and through time. So, for example, one football field is going to change throughout the course of a season. And when I say change, I mean its surface properties and the way that it's going to play and perform with respect to how the athletes are going to interact with it. Changes could happen by rainfall. Field could be really wet or during a dry period when the field gets dried and is only irrigated. That can influence how hard it is, how soft it is, things like that. So that's just one example. There's several examples. And then also how fields change through space. So how one field is different from another field, whether it be differences in grass species, soil type, things like that. And so this review paper just highlights those changes within and between natural turfgrass sports fields, because in athlete surface interaction research to date, a lot of times this variability, especially for natural turfgrass sports fields, has been unaccounted for. So the goal of this paper was to show that natural turfgrass fields can change and will change, and that will likely influence the way that athletes interact with them.
Yeah, and I know something that was really cool about this was kind of talking about this need to connect the athlete data to the field data. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship or maybe that gap that you see?
Yeah, so in the sports field management industry, a term called performance testing is becoming more and more common. It's not as common as we would like it to be, but nonetheless, people, at least sports field managers, are becoming more aware of it, and they're trying to implement some form of it. And what performance testing is basically quantifying surface properties of sports fields. So there's specific properties that you can measure on an athletic field surface. For example, soil moisture, surface hardness, shear strength or traction. So the ability for athletes to get grip, or the ability for the turf to resist divoting. All of these things can be objectively measured, and we call it all of this objective measurements collectively performance testing of sports fields. So as that becomes more and more common and we start understanding how these measurable surface properties can change over time, it's really important to connect that to athlete data, which I'll talk about here in a minute, to kind of guide our management. Because right now in the sports field management industry, we use these buzzwords like player safety, field playability, and we use our objective measurements of performance testing to say if a field is safe or playable. But we really don't know what a safe or playable field is unless we have the athlete data to go along with it, so that we can ensure that it's actually safe and playable, because they're the ones that determine that, right? So it's really important to tie in the athlete data with this field data. And on the sports science side of things, they're already collecting a ton of different athlete performance variables, injury variables, psychological variables, that can be connected to the field measurements that we on the turfgrass side are able to collect. And collectively, using all of this data, then we can start really developing specific site-specific management plans for specific fields, specific teams, even specific star athletes, if we wanted to get that, if we wanted to really get specific, to gear the management of the sports field to meet the needs and the expectations of the athletes and the teams.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't realize you could get down to like the player level, but I guess that makes sense as every athlete is different. So as part of this review, you were kind of going over all of these different aspects that play into this connection between kind of the properties of a field versus the player's experience and perceptions of the field. We've already talked about one of them a little bit, which was kind of just the innate properties of a grass or soil, whether that's that hardness, wetness, the species of grass, the shear strength. But then there's also 4 other categories that you were kind of studying. So I would love if you could kind of go over each one of those, explain what it is, and maybe a little bit of how you were testing that, or they, the researchers that were doing this, in their studies. So the first one is biomechanics. Can you explain that one?
So biomechanics is essentially, well, first of all, let me start with these 4 categories are all outside of the realm of my expertise. And I've been fortunate to, on my graduate committee, I had a biomechanics professor who also helped me with some of my injury research. When I was doing my postdoc at the University of Minnesota, I worked with a sports psychology person. So I've been fortunate to kind of cross disciplines, like you said, and do interdisciplinary research. So I do have a background in most of these 4 things, these 4 sections, but it's definitely not my main area of research because I'm a turfgrass scientist. But I do what I can. I've learned a lot working with them over the years, especially developing this review paper. I've kind of had to dive into a lot of these different categories and learn a lot about them. But with that being said, basically the way that athletes interact with the surface in this particular review paper, like you said, we broke it down into 4 categories. And the first one was biomechanics. And this is probably where most of the research to date has been done, looking at how athletes interact biomechanically with the surface. Most of the work is focused in a laboratory setting. So what they've done is they'll simulate different sports field scenarios in a lab. So they'll grow, for example, a grass playing surface within trays, and the trays will have maybe a different grass species, maybe a different soil type, maybe a different soil moisture level or surface hardness level. And then they'll bring in actual athletes. These trays will be on force plates, so they'll be able to measure the amount of force that athletes are able to apply to the surface whenever they do certain athletic maneuvers. So they'll have these trays on the force plates, and then they'll bring in athletes, and the athletes will be asked to perform certain athletic maneuvers. And then from that, they will measure whatever. Typically, it's some kind of peak load or peak vertical loading rate or some kind of turning or cutting motion, and they'll try to compare these athletic maneuvers to the different turfgrass scenarios that they have in their simulated lab on these trays. So that's kind of where the biomechanics side come in. Another big biomechanics research area is with the shoe surface interaction. So there's a lot of research that has been done looking at different cleat types and different stud patterns on shoes or cleats, and see how those interact differently with different grasses under different scenarios, soil type, whatnot. Um, so there's a lot of work that's been done on that. And the goal of the shoe surface interaction research is to try to identify the best performing shoes given whatever situation of field you're playing on.
So yeah, there's a couple things that I want to touch on here. So first, just a point of clarification for people who aren't maybe working in these fields. When you say biomechanics, that's kind of the biological, like actual physical mechanics of how someone is interacting. So like the actual impact of cleats digging into a surface or whatnot. That's correct. I'm understanding that right?
Correct. Yes. So it's mainly to the lower extremity is what people focus on, because obviously that's where the athletes will interact the most with the surface is through their feet and their leg. So a lot of the measurements biomechanically, a lot of the variables are different types of loads. So a load is basically just a force that the humans will apply to the surface, and then the amount of force that's applied back up onto the athlete, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I'm using the term correctly. But the other big thing that I really appreciate about this whole review paper and this whole approach you're taking is that it really does make a difference. You know, I think of times where I have played recreational softball extremely poorly, but I have done it before. And like, you know, there's a huge difference between Wrigley Field and some of the fields I've played on where there's like weeds popping up out of the sand,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and you're going to totally tear up your leg sliding in. So I really appreciate that there is kind of this more holistic approach of, you know, that's a different kind of grass at just my local field than there is at Wrigley. Like, and they obviously have a significantly larger budget. And I also just love it because first of all, I get jazzed listening about like the technology and just how much effort is put into that. But then also just seeing this very tangible result that you get, especially with some of the perceptions, which is another one of your categories. So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So perceptions is kind of going back to your point about your local community sports field versus Wrigley. Obviously, different levels of competition and different levels of play, different levels of field type are going to be completely different. So all of fields are different everywhere you go. And from that, one of the things that I was really interested in during my graduate school career was how these perceptions of fields influence the way that athletes may or may not perform within the field. Um, and I wasn't looking so much at how an athlete perceives one field versus another field. I was looking more so at how athletes perceive certain areas of a field. So, for example, on a football field, the middle of the football field is probably going to be the most, especially at the high school level and below. The middle of the football field is probably going to be very thin grass, likely highly compacted because that's where a majority of the game's going to be. The same could be said for recreational level fields. Maybe there's concentrated areas of traffic, foot traffic, where people enter or exit the field if it's close to a parking lot or close to a concession stand. So you have all these areas within fields that are different than the other areas that might not receive as much play. And some of it's very visual. If you walk out on a field, you can see where there's no grass versus a lot of grass. And to me, psychologically, this would have to affect the way that athletes perform or perceive how they're going to perform in the field. So a study that I did and a study that I talk about in this review paper when I was at the University of Georgia was with our recreational level club sports, soccer, ultimate frisbee, rugby, and lacrosse athletes. I did one-on-one interviews. They all shared one field at the University of Georgia, and they played all their games and they practiced on one field. So you can imagine there's a lot of variation within the field just based on traffic patterns and whatnot from play. So I interviewed several of the athletes, I think 25 of the athletes, And I had them identify what they perceived as their best and their worst locations within the field. And I had them actually take me to those locations. And then I had them explain to me why or if they would change the way that they behaved based on the condition of these locations. And the vast majority, I think 24 out of 25, told me that they would be hesitant, they would perform tentatively, and they, in some cases, would try to completely avoid certain bad areas on the field. So this is obviously very important, right? We at sports field managers or anybody who manages sports fields do not want that to happen. They want the field to be uniform. They want athletes to feel safe in all areas of the field. But in some situations, especially at the recreational level, a uniform field, especially grass, is just not possible due to budget or management constraints, high usage, field usage. So this is obviously going to affect the way that athletes perform. And psychologically, it kind of opened my eyes up to this whole idea of researching athletes' perception of athletic fields. And I got into it a little bit when I was a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, where we tied in some new technologies to try to monitor, because in the study that I just talked about that I did at Georgia, we interviewed the athletes whenever they weren't performing. So even though they said that they would perform differently in these areas, do they actually perform differently in these areas? And if they don't perform differently, then maybe that might be a reason why they get injured in these areas, if they get injured in these areas, because maybe psychologically they're thinking about these areas, but they still perform to a maximum level or whatever in these areas, and they shouldn't. They should actually be more tentative because it is a higher risk for injury in these areas, and then they end up getting hurt. If that makes sense. I don't know if that made sense.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So this is an area of research that it's not there. It's non-existent. As far as comparing perceptions of athletes to objective field data, there has been some studies, and I talk about this in the review paper, where researchers have asked athletes to subjectively rate areas within the field. So does it perform good? Does it perform bad? Does it perform poorly? And I think that's good. I definitely think that's good information to have an understanding of what athletes perceive the playing surface to be, but to have that objective field data to compare to those perceptions is going to be most useful, because you can actually use the objective data to create thresholds, to develop management plans for the field, and try to really make improvements.
Yeah, I really like this, because the analogy I'm coming up with, which I'm so sorry to anyone who knows better about this than me, and if I'm just completely wrong, but it's kind of like connecting a certified crop advisor or like a turfgrass manager to the farmer, or in this case, it'd be the people that are actually using the field, because they are getting that day-to-day experience that really makes them knowledgeable in a very different way than the people that are like, okay, now that we know we have this issue, here's how to actually take care of it. So I really like that there's just kind of this knitting together of these two different types of knowledge. I like that a lot. Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Chase's article, A Review of Turfgrass Sports Field Variability and Its Implications on Athlete Surface Interactions, published in Agronomy Journal, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. You can find a link to it in our show notes. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can also take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. The next category is performance and physiology, and those are kind of tied into some of the things we've talked about before with biomechanics, but there is a difference. So can you walk us through that one?
Yeah, so performance is focusing primarily on the athlete's ability to perform certain athletic maneuvers, such as turns and cuts, agility drills, If it's soccer, different shufflings or dribbles. But it also focuses on things, agility, speed, how fast an athlete's able to move across different surfaces, things like that. And then there's also this physiological component of athletes. So like muscle activity, different types of cardio measurements, such as heart rate and things like that, different metabolical components of athletes. And this is another under-researched area in athlete surface interactions on natural turfgrass fields, especially. There's actually, in the review paper, we only talk about two, and one was just a case study where they followed one athlete. It was a soccer player, and they basically watched him over 11 games, and they measured surface hardness on the field. The games, all 11 games were played on the same field, and they measured the surface hardness of the field before the game, and then they recorded the game, and they basically did frequency measurements. So how often did this player do low and high intensity activities? How often did he do moderate turns, high intensity turns, different types of cutting maneuvers? And they compared the frequency of all of these different athletic maneuvers to the hardness of the field. And it was just a case study. I can't remember exactly what they found, but I'm pretty sure they did find some differences between when a field was harder versus softer for certain athletic maneuvers. That's just an example of a type of study looking at performance. Another one was recent. They set up an agility course on two different surfaces. One surface was harder and one surface was softer. And then they had athletes perform the agility course, and they measured different muscle activity measurements in the leg, and then also measured how quickly they were able to perform the agility course. And there were differences between the two surfaces. The athletes are typically able to run faster on a harder surface and run slower on a softer surface. And I always give the analogy of running on concrete versus running on the beach, right? You always feel like you can run fast when you run on a harder surface. And then whereas with the beach, you have to exert more energy, takes a little bit more effort, you get fatigued a little quicker, and you have to use different muscle types. So those are some of the performance and physiological studies that have been done. It's really just those two that I found on natural turf grass. So definitely another area that needs to have more research. This is one area that out of the four we're going to talk about, this is the area that I've done nothing with. I would like to do more in the future, but I just haven't met anybody that researches this particular topic. But it would definitely tie in pretty well with some of the research that I do as far as the performance testing of the field. If we could find somebody who is also capable of measuring some of these performance and physiological variables.
Yeah, absolutely. We will have your contact information. So if anyone's out there and wants to forge a new path,
Absolutely.
please reach out. This last category is injuries. So can you talk to us about that one?
The athlete injury research that's been done has been primarily on artificial versus natural grass, and comparing the two surfaces. There's been a limited number of research that's been done focused solely on natural grass, where objective data has been measured as well for the comparisons to injury. And most of the objective data from the field that's been used for comparison to injuries has been surface hardness. And because there's this whole ideal that surface hardness is going to influence, most people think of head to surface interactions, or whenever they fall and hit their head, or they fall and hit any kind of, or their arm or something. But the hardness of a field can influence performance, biomechanics, all other types of athlete surface interactions. So it's not just an injury that happens because the surface is hard. It's all this physiological, biomechanical component that goes with it. So that's why hardness has always been a main field variable that's focused on, because people believe that that's one of the most important ones. And it could be. I think there's a lack of research that's been done on this topic, so it's really not fully understood. So it's definitely an important variable, but definitely a limitation to the injury research that's been done is that it focuses solely on surface hardness. And the majority of the studies that have been done, which there's only about a handful of them, have found no correlation between injury types and surface hardness, which is very interesting. At the University of Georgia, I did a study where we looked at the influence of within field variability of several variables, not just surface hardness, on athlete injuries. So, were athletes getting injured in certain areas of the field? And in those areas, what was the surface characteristics like? So, we measured surface hardness, soil moisture, turfgrass quality, which is just the density and color of the turf, and then turfgrass shear strength, which is what we were doing was simulating like a rotational traction. So if an athlete was to plant his foot and then turn, and we collected a lot of data points over the entire field, and we created these heat maps, which I have a figure in the review, which essentially will show high and low values of all of these field properties across the field. So for example, a soil moisture map might be on a color scale where darker blue areas are the wettest areas in the field, lighter blue areas are the driest areas in the field. And we had all of these maps of all of these variables across a season, and then we tracked where on the field the athletes were getting injured so that we could compare injury locations to actual values at specific areas where the athletes got injured. And what we found was actually pretty interesting. Um, Similar to other studies, surface hardness did not play a role in the injuries. And we were looking mainly at lower extremity injuries. But we did find that athletes were getting more injured in the wettest part of the field and in the areas with the least amount of turfgrass cover. What's even more interesting is whenever we would create these heat maps is we would typically have these large blobs of high and low valued areas. And if you lay the injuries over these maps, the injuries weren't happening right in the middle of these high and low areas. They were happening along the edges of these areas. So what that kind of makes us think is as an athlete's transitioning from a kind of an average area within the field with respect to soil moisture and turf quality. And then as they're transitioning into these other high and low valued areas, kind of the unpredictability of the playing surface might be what is causing the athletes to become injured. Whether it be physically, maybe they're rolling an ankle or not able to get traction, so they slip and fall, or maybe going back to the psychological component, maybe they act differently and they perform tentatively, which might lead to some kind of muscle spasm or something. So that was a really interesting finding that we had. And it kind of encourages future research to look at other variables. Well, to look at two things, look at within field variability because the field's going to change within it, but also to look at other variables other than surface hardness.
That's amazing. I love this image of overlaying these maps because I'm a giant nerd, so I'm just like imagining this very like high tech, like hologram Iron Man level like interface here. So I love that, but I also I love that it like backs up your whole like approach to this of you really do have to look at all of the variability on so many different levels. So what are some of the overarching results that you've seen as a result of this study, whether that's gaps in research, areas for future research, those bigger, larger implications and takeaways for this paper? Can you talk about those?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I wanted to do this review paper was because as I was doing some of my other research, I was just noticing, especially with the sports science side of things, that there was just a lack of reporting on actual field conditions. And it was even just the basic what's the grass species and what's the soil type. And as a turfgrass scientist and even a turfgrass manager, all of this data, the athlete data, whether it be the biomechanics, the injuries, the performance, whatnot, it doesn't really mean anything if we don't understand what type of surface they were performing on. So I think one of the main things that we wanted to highlight in this review was just report the most simplest field characteristics. Even if you don't have some of these devices to measure the objective surface properties like hardness and soil moisture and whatnot. We really wanted to encourage um, reporting, at least in the sports science side of things, of grass species, soil type, mowing height, how tall is the grass, because maybe that could influence something. Irrigation practices, because that's obviously going to influence soil moisture. Were weather conditions, which actually some of the injury studies do consider weather conditions, but not all of them. So what are the weather conditions? Um, so those are the main things, is to really focus on reporting those simple field characteristics, so that when somebody like myself or a field manager or somebody in Turfgrass reads this, they can actually interpret it and have some sort of ideal of what field conditions these athletes are on. Don't just say natural grass, which is a very common term and a common thing to do, is just say this study was performed on a natural grass field without giving any other further detail. So that was one of the main things. And then another thing was just to encourage collaboration in these research studies, because I've done a couple injury studies, I've done a couple athlete perception studies, and I would have never been able to do some of the sports science component of it unless I worked with somebody who knew more than I did about it. And I think the feeling is kind of mutual when it comes to some of these performance testing and field testing variables. Maybe the sports science folks don't really know that much about that. And obviously they don't have the same reporting system because they fail to report some of the easiest characteristics of a field that you can, like I said. So having that collaboration to kind of fill in the gaps between the two disciplines is really important. So that was something else that we really wanted to stress and encourage from this review. And then also just to encourage more field research in the actual field. I touched on it when I talked about the biomechanics, but a lot of things are done in the lab. And I'm not saying at all that that's a bad thing. I mean, there's definitely, the research needs to continue in the lab as well, because you have a more controlled environment. But there's just so many variables that go into an athletic field, and the athletic field components, some of these measurable components that we've talked about. And it's just really hard to account for that in a laboratory setting under such a simulated condition. And there's technologies that are coming out, which we can talk about here in a little bit, but there's technologies that are coming out that are going to make taking the research in the lab out to the actual field a lot easier. And that's hopefully going to be some of the stuff that I hope to work on here in the next several years, as far as advancing the work that I've done.
Yeah, and let's just talk about that now. That was going to be my next question: is where you're headed? Where are you going with this?
So what I'm going to focus on, hopefully from here on out, is kind of building on the preliminary work that I've done. And a lot of work that I've done is preliminary. It's been small scale with just a few athletes on just a couple fields. But to really build and tie in some new technologies. And I've learned quite a bit working with some of the sports science folks that I've been fortunate to work with on really adding in different types of athlete wearable technologies. So what I mean by wearable technologies are GPS technologies, GPS athlete trackers, pressure insoles and cleats. All of these things can help collect athlete data in real time as they're actually competing, and make it much simpler for you to make comparisons, real world scenarios between athletes, performance, injuries, whatnot, and field conditions. So an avenue that I've already started, I did at the University of Minnesota, was use GPS athlete trackers on rugby and soccer players. And the goal of that study was to see how field conditions influence the speed of the game. So with these GPS trackers, we're able to measure how fast athletes move. And we wanted to kind of look at it holistically under certain field conditions. So when the field's wet or dry, or when the field's hard or soft, how does that influence the speed of the game? And then even take it another step further, going back to my maps that I talked about in the injury study that I did. are changes within the field affecting the speed of the game? So is the speed of the game in the middle of the field different than when they're in a different area of the field? And we're looking at this at a whole team level as well as an individual athlete level. And the advantage of these GPS trackers, at least the ones that I've been working with, is they allow you to do pre and post match surveys with each athlete. And you can take all of that information, the speed data, the perceptions data, the survey data, and compare that to field conditions to really get an understanding of what role the field plays in whatever it is you're looking at. If you're looking at perceptions or injuries or performance, whatnot. So that's kind of an avenue that I've went down in Minnesota, and I'm trying to expand on here at Texas A&M. And another thing that I'd like to do is to incorporate the pressure insoles and cleats. So that's going to give you some of the biomechanic data, so the loads. And I'm hoping that I can tie together the GPS data with the shoe data so that we can see how athletes adjust biomechanically within certain areas of the field.
I love this. I'm getting so excited listening to this. But I've had you on the line for a while. I don't want to take your entire day. So we've got 3 questions left. First one, if people want to learn more about this, other than obviously your research paper itself, what is maybe like 1 or 2 key resources where people could go to learn more about these things?
I think Google Scholar is definitely a big one. And then also just local associations, whether it be turfgrass related. We have the Sports Turf Managers Association. There's a lot of sports science associations that are involved in this type of work. You could go on their websites. Google is probably going to be the best. Twitter, Turfgrass is really active on Twitter. While there's not a lot of people in Turfgrass doing this particular type of work, you can still learn a lot about our industry on Twitter, especially the golf side of it. We're very active on Twitter. And just Google. I think that's the easiest way.
Yeah, those are some great resources. So then the second question is, if people want to then take that next step to get involved, how can they do that?
Well, I think if anybody has kids that play sports, or if there's people out there that are still playing sports, maybe try to get to know the field manager, try to get to know who manages the field, and if they implement any kind of testing, or if they would be eager to hear, your input on field quality, and just build a relationship with your field manager. And that's another kind of goal here with this type of research that I've done, is to open up that dialogue so that there's a better understanding of what expectations are of field quality. And I think, as a parent myself, my kids aren't playing sports yet, but if a field's really bad, I would like for it to be fixed. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. And the only way that it can be fixed is to tell somebody about it. So, I mean, just open up a dialogue with whoever, manages fields that you play on, or somebody play on. And yet, share some of the research. If you read any of the research that's been done on field testing and athlete surface interactions, we get questions all the time from over-eager high school parents who manage their high school fields, and they want to learn how to do some of the stuff that we do, which is great. But it's really just kind of knowing about it, and knowing that all this testing is possible, and manipulating field conditions is possible. People don't understand that, and the way that you can change field conditions is really easy. I mean, you could raise lower mowing heights, you can irrigate, not irrigate. Really simple management practices that can really make big changes on a field. So if you want to get involved and try to improve your local field, then start the conversation. That would be the first step.
Sure. I have a supplemental question to that, which maybe this varies too much from place to place to be of any real value. But so I have grown up living across from like fields for quite a long time, and I wouldn't even know where to go. So if it's not at like a school or a college level, if it's a more community level, like how do you find out who that person is in order to make those connections? Do you just contact the city, or how does that work?
I'm going to put my political hat on here and say that only contact the city if it's positive, because I feel like a lot of people are going to contact cities if it's negative. I think that in all seriousness, probably the city. Yeah, most of the time the park and rec is going to be run by the city, and then the city's going to have a field manager. There's associations, park and recs are involved with some of the local associations or the national associations that I'm involved with. They're typically very well educated on the turfgrass science and field management. They would understand, some of these field properties that I've talked about today. Reaching out to them, reaching out to the city to find out who that person is. And I'm sure that they would value any input, especially if it was positive.
Yes, obviously. be as kind as you can. Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. And then final question.
Well, you know what? Can I go back? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, please.
I think there's another important point to that, especially the park and rec and the community level. I think this is a good opportunity to say it, is oftentimes at that level, the resources that go into those types of fields don't meet the expectations for the field. So if you're a disgruntled parent because of field conditions, that's typically not the field manager that's the issue. It's that the resources aren't going in to maintain the fields to the standard that's expected. And if that's the case, then I think you should definitely reach out to your city, and hopefully the city would be on board to provide the field managers, whoever is in charge with the field, managing the field, with the resources to meet those expectations and meet the demand of the field. Because that's a really unfortunate circumstance at that level. The community level is that the resources just aren't put into them, but the expectations and the demand for them are so high.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so then final question for you is, if all people had was your research, what is one fun fact that they wouldn't know about you?
I don't know. I guess I do a lot of athlete surface interaction type work. I do a lot of sports field work. So maybe people would, if people knew me, I'm 6'5", so I'm kind of a big guy. So people might assume I play sports. I don't play sports. So they might think I'm like a jock, but I'm really not. I'm a pretty big nerd. Me and my wife like to play board games and video games and watch movies, and that's pretty much what we do for fun. That's probably the biggest fun fact I have. I got 2 boys with another boy on the way. We just live the happy family life.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
That all sounds wonderful. Thanks for being on the show. I learned a ton. Even as we were talking, I was learning and just absorbing so much. So thank you for all the work that you're doing and all the work that you hope to do. And thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find a link to today's paper and other resources for this episode in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcast if you like our show. We are also available on Lyceum, the world's first audio learning community, where you can join our discussion group and comment on each episode. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by authors are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.